Hi, everybody. It's week 7. Hard to believe we are at the halfway point now that we've finished this week of class. Halfway point is a little weird in class that has 15 weeks, but here we go. And we're done with Austin and we're in kind of a new module, a new month of uh consideration. And we're moving towards a consideration of the Caribbean, the Haitian Revolution, other kind of things that are happening in that space that resonate even today. In fact, at the time of this recording, the Haitian Revolution has rarely been more relevant in United States discourse, unfortunately. Uh, so we're kind of taking a moment to play our way into this part of the semester. And so we played the slave uprising scenario of Dialect, a game about language and how it dies. And you can find elsewhere in my previous vlog posts from last semester how I run Dialect in an undergraduate classroom that meets on Tuesdays and Thursdays for 75 minutes. There, uh, we basically run it across several days, taking kind of care to meticulously collect all of the cards and make sure that they're in the right scenario. This was actually the first time I got to kind of play with my students. I only have 6 of them, and the game runs for 3 to 5 players, and so I facilitated, kind of on the side for all 6 of them for 1 table. And that actually worked really well. But I want to talk a little bit about how to make sure that you're going to hit the target of, in this case, fitting into a class that starts at 3:30 and ends by 6:10. So we have a pretty controlled amount of time. Dialect normally plays about 3 to 5 hours, depending on the number of players and depending on how deep in the role playing sauce they get. And also, there's just a learning curve with this. This is not a game that is easy in the sense that the kind of linguistic contortions of transforming language and thinking about how that works don't come kind of easily unless maybe you're incorporating this into a linguistics course, in which case that's super cool. Uh, and so the way that I did it was and we're also dealing with more players than the game officially runs. And I will say, in terms of options in the card deck, you can kind of scoosh it to 6 players. You do lose a little bit of the options in terms of the number of rolls. Normally, you're dealing out 3 rolls to each player, and they're picking one. About half the table got 3 roll options. And the way we did that very simply was the people with 3 in their hand, as soon as they knew they weren't gonna use one, they could throw it down, and the people with 2 cards could take a look at those. There was a lot of, kind of discussion, of shifting around. Dialect is played with a setup of an isolation. In other words, a reason why these people are, kind of a community that is untouched by other people for the period of the game. The isolation is set up, and at the end of the game, the isolation is over. Either the language group no longer is coherent, either because people leave or because it kind of is not isolated anymore and thus is being touched by other peoples from other places. So this can be like something like you're the first colonists on Mars. In our case, the initial scenario is really a kind of setup of something very much like the aftermath. I mean, it's called slave uprising. It is so what happens after that conflict is over, the island is kind of nothing but newly free, formerly enslaved folks. And how do you get to building? Now, importantly, as opposed to something like reacting to the past, which is a historical simulator where you're all playing specific historical characters, that's not what we're doing here. You This is a thought experiment. So what was really interesting was um, me showing. I was doing a lot of work as a facilitator, noting the ways that the kind of connotations they were building with their language. For example, the word Manhattan was used as a explicit like Manhattan Project allusion. I'm like, okay, so we've built a world where this is clearly not the 18th century, right? Like we are in some other time and yet we exist in a place where the Manhattan Project is somehow meaningful, right? And this is a yes and project. Like this was I never gave students the like you can't do that. It was just here's the implications of your choice. Are those the things that you want? And then how do we build on that? It was really cool to kind of see and attend to those things. It made us very kind of aware of those kinds of things. There's some really interesting moments where like the word protectorate came up and I was like, "Hey, this feels a lot like Cromwell." The protectorate was prior to the start of the long 18th century, which starts with the restoration of the British monarchy. Before that, there's a protectorate, and the protectorate goes from, kind of changes in meaning over time as it did in our own game. So there was some interesting parallels that we had time to break down. Thanks to, I would say we took um, I would say about 2 hours to run the game, all told, and then we had debrief for the rest of the time. And the way that we achieved that, Dialect, you set up the isolation, you create some very quick and dirty characters, you make sure that they've got connections to the different aspects, the things that everyone knows to be important to this community. All the language ties to those aspects, and those aspects are the things that change as we move from age one to age two to age three to the kind of aftermath. um, and so for age 1, to make sure that everyone kind of knew the mechanism, everyone took a turn, which is taking one of their cards, creating a term relating to that card that's connected to one of the aspects, defining it, writing a card with that definition, and then playing through or having other people play through a dialogue that shows how different people relate to that word. And then we took a break, and then for ages 2 and 3, 3 students, kind of iterated the language, with by taking turns for age 2. We then moved on to age 3, the other half of the students, kind of moved then, and then we all did the final, or they all did, I'm still just the facilitator, um, the epilogues that come with the legacy move. And then we had plenty of time to kind of do a very, like, for me, inspired by Alice is Missing, like, what are we leaving behind? What are we taking with us? I'm not gonna lie, there were some things that were pretty close to home, in a weird kind of way for me. And I think that because what the story that was told was a story of a consensus-based community, fragmenting and fracturing until it was destroyed by outside forces, is well, that's rough. To kind of see a dream degrade in those kinds of ways. But yeah, so we managed to tell an efficient but still really resonant and punchy story. One that like one of my students literally was like, I kind of want to get a tattoo of this, like inspired by this game, this play session, which was really kind of amazing. Um, so yeah, I think it was successful. The it but it didn't do exactly what I expected it to do. So this is, as I said, the start of a kind of opening into our examination of where the Caribbean is in the late 18th and into the early 19th century, right? This is a class on 18th century studies. And we're moving towards M. Norbace Phillips' poem Zong, which is based on the Zong massacre. More on that next week. And then we're moving on to the work of Alyssa Sepinwall, and games inspired by the Haitian Revolution and other depictions of the Haitian Revolution, which in turn will lead to us thinking about Polydori's The Vampire, which was written in the same context as Frankenstein, and then the immediate follow up, The Black Vampire, which was written and inspired by the events in Saint Domingue in Haiti. Um, and so this so one of the things I pointed out to students was, because we just jettisoned the kind of idea that the community was of formerly enslaved people very quickly, which I think made sense in terms of kind of the linguistic choices and the aspects and things like that. Um, but also, this is a table of folks who are not Black, and for whom kind of the history of chattel slavery is a concept more than a kind of ancestral memory, which means that it would go very differently in a group that had one or more participants who for whom this was a visceral thing. We had a bunch of safety tools. We would probably have leaned on those safety tools a heck of a lot more. These are the things that you think about, but also and it's important for me to remind everybody, I do practice the open door policy even though I'm teaching this in a classroom. Students are not required to complete play if there's too much if something becomes too much. We do use things like the X card and scene change, so like pause, rewind, fast forward. We didn't have cause to use those. I think I was tempted in a couple of moments, but it didn't cut close enough to the bone for me to kind of pause, or kind of intervene in those kinds of ways. Um, but yeah, so I mean, I think it's really important to note who was playing, right? This was a small group of graduate students who have been working together for weeks in this class and have known many of them have known each other for longer. In a space that had kind of very been carefully cultivated. If I was teaching uh and running dialect in my TTRPG course, as I talk about in my other vlogs, I give students more of a choice in what they want to tackle. And dialect lends itself to a lot of much less visceral, much less sensitive topics. So this was a big risk. And it's one that we were able to pull off precisely because we are a little remote. But highlighted to the students that that is a lacuna, that is a gap in our knowledge and embodied awareness and all of these kinds of things, and that we are going to backfill, right? And I prompted students to think about, as we kind of move through the next couple of weeks, how might we play this game differently? This same scenario, the same isolation, if we were keeping more to the forefront of our mind the history of things like the Zong massacre, things like the Haitian Revolution and what led up to it and the aftermath, all of those kinds of things, which I think that at this opening point were just not present. And I don't know that I would say, like, necessarily it's gonna be interesting when we get to Stars and Wishes at the end of the semester about whether the students are gonna argue, "Oh, we should have played dialect at the end of this unit of thinking rather than at the beginning." I think it's a trade-off more than a, like, this has clear advantages over this option. Um, there was more freedom in, kind of unrestrictedness. He At the beginning, it might get into historical emulation if we were playing it at the other end of the unit. Um, and so there's also that. Um, we also, the world building, I mean, I think what's interesting about, dialect is, like, there's emergent world building that's implied by what you're doing, but there's still stuff that gets a little fuzzy and strange, because of that emergent nature, which I think is super interesting because, like, the gaps are where the light gets in so many of these kinds of games, especially for me as a teacher, right? Like, I'm not necessarily operating the way that some folks who run games do, which is like, I want to have a kind of beautifully coherent, narratively satisfying, shapely and beautiful whole. I mean, that's a nice to have from my perspective. What I'm actually more interested in is the ragged edges allow us to kind of poke at the system or poke at what we've done and think about iteration, or it allows it those kinds of holes and frictions show off the mechanism and the mechanism at work far more effectively. So yeah, so this is also going to be the week that students try their first attempt at a play report. And they have a more formal play report for the game they're running outside of class or playing outside of class, depending. It's about half are doing video games, about half are doing tabletop role playing games for their outside work. But this is just asking them to kind of do a much more informal kind of play report because they also have a journal reading exercise where they are reading they're taking doing a deep dive into a journal of their choice from the 18th century or from game studies, taking a wide look at the titles of all of the articles from the last 10 years, looking at kind of abstracts from a more constrained amount of time, reading several articles, and then doing a deep dive into the very kind of nature of the construction of one article in particular to kind of understand a journal. So that's their kind of heavy lift for this week in terms of the work they're doing in terms of class. So, they didn't have much to prep aside from like familiarizing themselves with the rules of dialect, very superficially, for class, but they've got this other kind of intellectual task that they're facing. And of course, next week is not gonna be easy. It's not a Philip's Zong is a book length poem, and as I told students and reminded students, and I encourage you to go get a copy and take a look, it's a beautiful work, but it's a work that resists the idea of mastery. You experience it. It is a ritual you participate in. It is something you take joy and pleasure in, even though it's rooted and sourced in the bloody legal kind of violence of the kind of assessment of the Zong massacre. I asked the poet, when I was lucky enough to hear her do a reading and ritual from this poem earlier this year, whether play was even an acceptable lens through which to understand the poem. To which she enthusiastically said yes, and immediately this got 2 weeks on the syllabus. Because I think it's worth that. The first week is just going to be immersing ourselves in the language of the poem, and the week after really is kind of doing the work of um, uh, kind of returning with the guidance of my far more expert colleague, Dr. Zora Hamsa, who will help us think about the poem as ritual and tie it to the Black womanist and feminist tradition and other kinds of intellectual traditions that I am familiar with, but I am not a home speaker of in the ways that my colleagues are. And so I'm very, very grateful to have the benefit of her intellectual work. And of course, so that's week 8 and week 9. And then we'll take a little bit of a digression break because it'll be big bad con time. And thus it will be time for our other guest for this semester, Quentin Smith, who will talk about the nature of writing about games, reporting about games, researching about games, and speaking to different kinds of public audiences in different formats, and the state of games journalism. And so, if you're looking to kind of get a jump on that, Nieborg and Foxman's work, Mainstreaming and Game Journalism, which came out from MIT last year, is available open access, totes free on the MIT Press's website. In addition to Gita Jackson's The New Game Journalism, same as the Old Games Journalism, and Kieran Gillen's The New Game Journalism from 2004. But all that is coming up in the future. For now, we are cruising towards next week's fall break, which is not a break from class because fall break is 2 days at the end of the week, and we meet, of course, on Tuesdays. So thinking about Zong in the kind of different intellectual traditions of both how we think about um, the voices of Black folks in the 18th century as well as today. And so I think in that sense, dialect was a soft, it was more of a soft entrance than I expected it to be, but I'm not bad about it. I'm curious what you think and questions you might have. Feel free to throw them into the comments. As always, I appreciate the community of thinkers and curious folks who find these little vlogs useful. I hope this one was helpful. And if it wasn't helpful, just look up dialect from last year's videos, and maybe that'll be more helpful. Um, in any case, see you next week.